The Viking Age in England. Long before the Normans, long before the great castles and the knights in armor that most people picture when they think of medieval England, there was another age. A fiercer age. An age of longships and firelight, of raided monasteries and desperate kings. It began, as so many great changes do, from across the sea. In the late 8th century, from the fjords and coastlines of Scandinavia, a people began to venture outward. Bold, skilled, and often ruthless. We call them the Vikings. This is that story. The word Viking is thought to come from an Old Norse word meaning something like a pirate raid, or a sea journey. Not all Scandinavians of this era were raiders. Many were farmers, traders, and craftspeople who stayed at home. But the ones who came to England, at least in those early years, came looking for wealth. They came from three main regions. The Danes, from what is now Denmark, would have the greatest impact on England. The Norwegians raided and settled in Scotland, Ireland, and the north of England. The Swedes largely headed east, into Russia and beyond. What drove them outward? Historians have debated this for years. Some point to overpopulation and a shortage of good farmland in Scandinavia. Others highlight advances in shipbuilding that suddenly made long ocean voyages possible. Some suggest that political upheaval at home pushed younger sons, who stood to inherit nothing, to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Whatever the reasons, by the end of the 8th century, they were coming. And England, with its wealthy monasteries, its undefended coastal towns, and its divided kingdoms, was a tempting target. The first raids. The date that historians traditionally mark as the beginning of the Viking Age is the 8th of June, 793. On that day, a fleet of ships appeared off the coast of Northumbria, in the northeast of England. The ships landed at a small island called Lindisfarne, Holy Island, as it is sometimes known. On that island stood one of the most sacred monasteries in all of England. A place of learning, a place to pray, and a place of precious treasures. The Vikings attacked without warning. Monks were killed. Some were thrown into the sea. Others were taken as slaves. The monastery was looted. Gold, silver, sacred relics, beautifully illuminated manuscripts. All of it was carried away to the longships. The shock across England was immense. A scholar named Alcuin, one of the most learned men of the age, wrote in horror that such a thing had never been seen before. That the heathens had desecrated the sacred place of the most holy of English saints. More raids followed quickly. In 794, the monastery at Jarrow was attacked. The following year, monasteries in Scotland and Ireland were hit. The pattern was becoming clear. Monasteries were ideal targets. They were often located on coasts or riverbanks, easy to reach by ship. They were rarely defended, and they contained enormous wealth, accumulated over generations of pious donations. Gold chalices, jeweled bindings, silver crosses. For the Vikings, they were treasure houses. For the next few decades, the raids continued in this way. Swift, brutal, and profitable. The Vikings would arrive, strike fast, and disappear back across the sea before any organized defense could be mounted. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England at this time were divided. There was no single king of England. Instead, there were several kingdoms. Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, Wessex in the south. They were frequently at war with each other, which made coordinating any response to the Viking threat extremely difficult. And the Vikings were very good at exploiting that weakness. The Great Heathen Army. For the first few decades of the Viking Age, the raids on England were mostly hit-and-run affairs. Terrible and destructive, certainly, but not an attempt to conquer and settle. That changed in the year 865. In the autumn of that year, a vast force landed on the coast of East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the great record of events kept by English monks, calls it the Great Heathen Army. Modern historians sometimes call it the Great Danish Army. Whatever the name, it was something England had never faced before. This was not a raiding party. This was an invasion force. The army was said to be led by the sons of the legendary Viking leader Ragnar Lothbrok. Names that have since become famous in legend. Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Ubba. Whether the legends around Ragnar himself are true or largely myth, historians still debate. But the sons were very real and very dangerous. The great heathen army moved through England with devastating efficiency. In 866, they captured York, the great city of the north, and made it their base. The kingdom of Northumbria fell. In 869, they turned south and crushed East Anglia. King Edmund of East Anglia was captured and, according to later accounts, executed when he refused to renounce his Christian faith. He was tied to a tree, shot with arrows, and beheaded. He was later declared a saint. Mercia, in the Midlands, was attacked next. The Mercian king paid the Vikings off with a large tribute, a payment of wealth in exchange for peace. The Vikings accepted. For now. By the early 870s, almost all of England had either fallen to the Vikings or was paying them to stay away. Only one kingdom remained unbroken. Wessex, in the south of England. And its young king was about to become one of the most celebrated figures in all of English history. Alfred the Great. Alfred became King of Wessex in 871, when he was just in his early 20s. He had not expected to be king. He was the youngest of 4 brothers. But one by one, his brothers had died, and the crown had passed to him at one of the most dangerous moments in English history. Almost immediately, he faced the full force of the Viking army. The fighting in those early years was relentless. Alfred won some battles, lost others. At times, the situation seemed hopeless. In the winter of 877 and 878, it very nearly was. A Viking force led by a king named Guthrum launched a surprise attack on the royal estate at Chippenham in Wiltshire. It was the dead of winter, when no one expected a military campaign. Alfred barely escaped with his life. For a time, he was a fugitive, hiding in the marshes of Somerset, in a place called the Isle of Athelney, cut off from most of his kingdom. It is from this period that one of England's most famous, if probably legendary, stories comes. The story of Alfred burning the cakes. Sheltering in a poor woman's cottage, distracted by his troubles, he let her cakes burn on the fire and was scolded for it. It is a small, very human story, and it has endured for over 1,000 years. But Alfred did not give up. From his hiding place, he sent out messengers. He gathered his forces. And in the spring of 878, he struck back. At the Battle of Edington, in Wiltshire, Alfred's forces met Guthrum's Viking army and defeated them decisively. It was a turning point. Guthrum was forced to negotiate. Under the Treaty of Wedmore, signed later that year, Guthrum agreed to be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather. It was a remarkable moment. The Viking king and the English king were bound together in the ceremony of Christian baptism. The treaty also divided England. The Vikings would rule the north and east, in a region that became known as the Danelaw. Alfred and his successors would rule the south and west. It was not a perfect solution, but it brought a measure of peace, and it kept Wessex alive. Alfred went on to do much more than simply survive. He rebuilt his kingdom. He constructed a network of fortified towns, called burhs, designed to make future Viking attacks more difficult. He reformed the law. He promoted learning and the English language. He even arranged for books to be translated into English so that ordinary people could read them. He is the only English monarch in history to be called the Great. And given what he faced and what he achieved, it is a title that is hard to argue with. The Danelaw and settlement. The Danelaw. That great swathe of northern and eastern England that the Vikings now controlled. It covered much of what we know today as Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, Leicestershire, and more. And within it, the Vikings did not simply raid and move on. They settled. They founded towns. York, already a significant city when they captured it, became one of the most important Viking settlements in the world. Known in Old Norse as Jorvik, it was a bustling, prosperous place. A centre of trade connecting England with Scandinavia and the wider Viking world. Archaeological excavations in York, particularly at a site called Coppergate, have revealed a remarkable picture of Viking life. Timber buildings lined narrow streets. Craftsmen worked with leather, metal, and bone. Merchants traded goods from as far away as the Byzantine Empire. People lived ordinary lives. They cooked, raised children, kept animals, and argued with their neighbors. The Viking settlers intermarried with the local Anglo-Saxon population. Languages mixed. Old Norse and Old English influenced each other deeply. Many common English words today come directly from Old Norse. The words sky, window, knife, husband, they, them, and their are all Norse in origin. Hundreds of place names in the north and east of England carry Viking roots. Any place name ending in by, meaning farm or settlement, such as Grimsby or Derby, is Norse. Endings like Thorpe, meaning village, or Thwaite, meaning a clearing, are also Old Norse. The Vikings were not simply destroyers. Where they settled, they built. But the struggle for England was not over. Alfred's children and grandchildren continued to push back against the Danelaw. His son Edward and his daughter Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, a remarkable woman who led armies herself, gradually recaptured Viking-held territory. Alfred's grandson Athelstan became, in 927, the first king to rule a unified England. For a time, it seemed the Viking Age in England might be drawing to a close. It was not. The Second Viking Age and Cnut. A new wave of raids began in the 980s, this time largely from Denmark under increasingly organized and powerful Danish kings. England at this point was ruled by a king remembered by history with one of its least flattering nicknames, Ethelred the Unready. The name does not quite mean what it sounds like. Unready in Old English meant poorly advised, or lacking in counsel. But the effect was similar. Ethelred's reign was marked by indecision, poor strategy, and a heavy reliance on paying the Vikings to go away. These payments were known as Danegeld, gold for the Danes. Enormous sums of silver, extracted from the English population through taxation, were handed over to Viking leaders in exchange for promises of peace. Promises that were rarely kept for long. The raids grew bolder. In one notorious episode in 1002, Ethelred ordered the killing of all Danes living in England. The St. Brice's Day Massacre. Among those killed was said to be the sister of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard. Sweyn's response was to invade England personally and with overwhelming force. By 1013, Sweyn had effectively conquered England. Ethelred fled to Normandy. Sweyn was declared king. But he died just weeks later, in February 1014. The struggle continued under Sweyn's son, Cnut. After years of brutal fighting against Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside, a settlement was reached. England was to be divided between them. But Edmund died in November 1016, and Cnut became king of all England. And here is where the story takes a surprising turn. Because Cnut turned out to be an exceptionally capable king. He converted to Christianity. He ruled according to English law. He surrounded himself with English advisors. He married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, cementing political alliances. He was, by the standards of the time, a just and effective ruler. The story of Cnut commanding the tide to go back, to demonstrate to his flattering courtiers that even a king had limits, is probably apocryphal. But it speaks to how he was remembered. As a man of realism and genuine power, not empty pride. Under Cnut, England was part of a great North Sea empire, encompassing Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. For a brief period, England sat at the heart of a Viking world. But empires built on one man's ability rarely outlast that man. Cnut died in 1035, aged only around 40. His empire quickly fragmented. Within a few years, the Old English royal line was restored, in the person of Edward the Confessor. The end of the Viking Age and its legacy. The Viking Age in England is generally considered to have ended in 1066. Not with a Viking victory, but with a Viking defeat. In September of that year, a Norwegian king named Harald Hardrada invaded the north of England, claiming the English throne. He was met by the English king Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, near York. It was a decisive English victory. Harold Hardrada was killed. The Norwegian threat was over. But Harold had no time to celebrate. Within days, news arrived that a Norman force had landed on the south coast of England. He marched his exhausted army south. And at the Battle of Hastings, on the 14th of October, 1066, Harold was defeated and killed. The Norman conquest had begun. The Normans themselves, it is worth remembering, were not entirely unconnected to the Viking story. Their name comes from the Northmen. Strangely, their ancestors were Vikings who had settled in northern France in the early 10th century. In just a few generations, they had adopted the French language and French customs. But the Viking blood and the Viking ambition ran in their veins. So strangely, the Viking Age ended in England with a Viking-descended person taking the English throne. History rarely draws clean lines. What did 300 years of Viking activity leave behind in England? The physical legacy is everywhere, if you know where to look. Hundreds of place names. Words in everyday language. The layout of towns like York. Archaeological treasures still being uncovered from the soil. The cultural and social legacy runs even deeper. The mixing of Anglo-Saxon and Norse people in the Danelaw created a distinct regional identity in the north and east of England that persisted for centuries. The legal and administrative traditions of the Danelaw influenced English law. The Viking concept of the Thing, a public assembly where disputes were settled and decisions made, contributed to early ideas about community governance. And then there is the human legacy. The millions of people alive today in England, and across the English-speaking world, who carry Viking ancestry in their DNA without perhaps ever thinking about it. The Viking Age was not simply a period of darkness and destruction, though it brought plenty of both. It was also a period of extraordinary energy and movement. Of people crossing seas, building towns, telling stories, and leaving their mark on the world. England was never quite the same after the Vikings came. And in many ways, that is precisely what makes the story worth telling. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this journey through the Viking Age, please consider liking and subscribing for more relaxing history stories. Leave a comment below and let us know which period of history you would like to explore next.